Hi folks, and welcome to the first in a series of deeper dive videos exclusively for the channel's Patreon supporters, coming to you from the slightly inappropriately relaxed setting of the reading corner in my editing office. This video and the subsequent episodes in this series are designed to take a much more detailed look at the findings contained in the AR6 synthesis report, or the summary for policymakers anyway, which was published on the 20th of March 2023. This thing represents the final chapter of the IPCC's 8-year odyssey to bring us their 6th assessment of the global response to the climate emergency. And while much of the work has already been done in the assessment reports published over the course of the last 18 months or so, which, as you know, I've already made videos about on the channel, I thought it was worth just having a close look at this final document, because we're not going to hear from the IPCC, at least not in any kind of official capacity, for a few years now. So the world will be kind of paddling on its own for a while. And with COP28 due to take place this coming November in the UAE, one of the world's richest oil states, and with the president of that COP meeting being Sultan Al Jaber, who's the chief executive of Abu Dhabi National Oil, which is the UAE's state-owned oil company, it feels a little bit like the global population has been given a set of instructions and then sort of sent off into the lion's den to fend for itself, which is worrying to say the least. We all know the broad headlines of the IPCC assessment, of course. They look a bit like this. The average global surface temperature is now at least 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer compared to 1850 to 1900 levels, with some research papers suggesting it's more like 1.2 degrees. And we know that the vast majority of this warming is due to human activity. That warming isn't just impacting on our way of life as human beings, but it's also having a devastating effect on nature's ecosystems and the millions of species of flora and fauna that rely on those ecosystems for their survival. The billions of people who are least culpable for the unprecedentedly rapid increase of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere are also those most likely to be severely impacted by its consequences. We know that if we continue to emit greenhouse gases, our atmosphere will continue to warm. And we know that on our current trajectory, we have absolutely no chance whatsoever of staying anywhere close to even 2 degrees of warming, let alone 1.5 degrees. What's required are deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and a greater focus on adaptation everywhere in the world, but especially in the most vulnerable geographical locations. That means more equitable solutions that move resources from the richest nations towards the poorest nations, because ultimately what happens in other parts of the world will eventually come back to visit us too. To do that, we'll take cold hard cash, either in the form of aid packages or in the form of financing arrangements that allow people in vulnerable countries to tackle the issues themselves, using their local knowledge to achieve the most appropriate and sustainable solutions. Technology will play a major part in adaptation and mitigation strategies in every part of the globe. The good news is that we literally have all the technologies we need right now. They're tried and tested, and in many cases, economies of scale have already brought costs tumbling down to extremely competitive levels. The world will need to learn a new way of operating, and that means every one of us will need to adopt new habits that facilitate a more sustainable way of life. And if we can achieve that, then our communities will be healthier, happier, and more resilient. We have procrastinated for far too long. The best time to act was about 40 years ago, and as the cliche goes, the second best time to act is right now. All very fine words from our friends at the United Nations, but what's lurking underneath them? I mean, what has the data from literally thousands of research initiatives all over the planet revealed? Where are the pinch points, if you like, and what exactly is happening to address them? Well, let's get stuck into the report and see what it says. First of all, where are we right now? The IPCC now uses the word unequivocal to refer to human influence on climate change. That might seem obvious to you and me, but to get that phraseology into a document that's now been ratified by 195 countries took years of negotiation and debate. Legal teams, mostly representing the fossil fuel industry, fought tooth and nail to avoid such an unambiguous description of the facts. And that's because their marketing and PR teams have relied on the exploitation of perceived uncertainties in the science in order to spread what many commentators now refer to as FUD. That roadblock has mercifully now been all but removed, and with the exception of a minority of admittedly very vocal and very irritating fanatics, the citizens and governments of pretty much every country on Earth now accept the reality and urgency of climate science. And by the way, you'll also see and hear the use of words like likely, very likely, almost certain, medium confidence, high confidence, very high confidence, and others throughout these deep dive videos. And those phrases aren't just plucked out from thin air either. They're extremely tightly defined attributions that correlate closely to the quantity and quality of data available for each variable or parameter that the IPCC are referring to. And again, those attributions were scrutinised and debated by all parties involved until consensus was achieved. The data range for temperature rise currently sits between 0.9 and 1.2 degrees Celsius. That's comparing the period between 1850 and 1900 to the period between 2011 and 2020. But that doesn't really tell us the whole story. The land warms up more than the oceans, for example. So temperature increases over our land masses have on average been in the range of 1.34 to 1.83 degrees Celsius, with the oceans warming in the range of 0.99 to 1.01 degrees. And the IPCC also points out that in perhaps one of the most ironic twists of our human story, the warming could have already been significantly worse if it hadn't been for the fact that, as well as mind-boggling amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuels also release airborne particles, or aerosols, that have had the tendency to fog up our skies and mask some of the radiative forcing. It's likely, says the IPCC, that the increase in greenhouse gases themselves, which by the way it says has unequivocally been caused by human activity since 1750, has resulted in warming in the range of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, but aerosols have caused a cooling effect in the range of 0 to 0.8 degrees Celsius. Natural phenomena like variations in the sun's strength and events like volcanic eruptions have, according to this report, had an almost negligible impact, despite what some of our friends in the climate denial community would have us believe. The report states with high confidence that 42% of all greenhouse gases emitted in the last 170 years were spewed out between 1990 and 2019. There's also high confidence that atmospheric CO2 concentrations are now greater than at any time in the last 2 million years. The IPCC has very high confidence that the other two main gases, methane and nitrous oxide, are at levels not seen for 800,000 years. Global net anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions were estimated to be 59 gigatons in 2019, give or take 6.6 billion tonnes. I should make a distinction here between purely CO2 levels and overall greenhouse gas levels, because I received several comments on my recent video about carbon dioxide removal asking exactly that question. So I think I quoted 37 gigatons in that video. That number is the calculation made by the International Energy Agency for anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions alone. Once you add in methane, nitrous oxide and a bunch of other stuff like HFCs and factor in their relative potency compared to CO2, which the science bods call global warming potential, or GWP, then you get to that overall CO2 equivalent number of 59 gigatons. Slightly depressingly, the report finds that with high confidence, emissions reductions as a result of improvements in energy intensity and carbon intensity of that energy in fossil fuel combustions and industrial processes, known as CO2 FFI, have been less than the increase in emissions that simply happened as a result of rising global activity levels in industry, energy supply, transport, agriculture and buildings. So that's all a bit rubbish, really. And the IPCC goes on to describe the impact that those atmospheric changes have had on our world already. For a kick-off, they say that between 1901 and 2018, global mean sea levels increased by 20 centimetres or about 8 inches. Human influence has very likely been the main cause of this since at least 1971. This is the stat that really knocked me off my stool though, as I mentioned in the summary video on YouTube. there are apparently as many as 3.6 billion people living in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. That's the best part of half the human species. The report makes the point that ecosystem vulnerabilities are interdependent and that regions that have the biggest constraints to development are the ones that have the highest vulnerability to climatic hazards, and millions of people in those areas are already feeling the pain of acute food insecurity and reduced water security. It's probably no great surprise that regions in the global south have bigger problems than rich industrial nations in the north. But the chasm is quite stark. In the decade between 2010 and 2020, the IPCC report found with high confidence that human mortality from floods, droughts and storms was no less than 15 times higher in those highly vulnerable regions compared to the wealthy Western countries that most of us live in. The report goes on to highlight hundreds of local species losses in developing areas that have been driven by extreme heat, and it states that impacts on some ecosystems are approaching irreversibility. That's stuff like hydrological changes resulting from the retreat of glaciers, or the changes in some mountain and Arctic ecosystems driven by permafrost thaw. Global agricultural productivity has actually increased in the past 50 years, but in mid and low latitude regions its growth has most likely been hindered by climate change. Conversely, and again quite ironically, there have been some positive impacts in some high latitude regions that are warming up and thawing out, in some cases revealing useful fertile land. That's a trend that will most likely continue, and at least in my own humble opinion, it'll have a massive influence on human migration patterns in the coming decades. And that's going really well at the moment, isn't it? According to the IPCC, climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in Africa, Asia, North America and Central and South America, with small island states in the Caribbean and South Pacific being disproportionately affected relative to their small population size. As I mentioned in the summary video, the occurrence of climate-related foodborne and waterborne diseases and the incidence of vector-borne diseases from bugs like mosquitoes have all seen an increase as a result of a warming climate. There is even now strong evidence of mental health challenges associated with increasing temperatures, as well as trauma from extreme events and loss of livelihoods and culture, the report says. Even in well-developed urban areas, climate change has impacted people's health and livelihoods and key infrastructure. If you live in a city, you will no doubt attest to the fact that hot extremes have intensified in recent years. The IPCC found that critical urban infrastructure like transportation, water, sanitation and energy systems have been compromised by extreme events, and by now it should come as no surprise at all that once again the impacts are concentrated amongst economically and socially marginalised urban residents. Then there's the oceans themselves. The report states with high confidence that ocean warming and ocean acidification have adversely affected food production from fisheries and shellfish aquaculture in some regions. Roughly half the world's population currently experiences severe water scarcity for at least part of the year due to a combination of climatic and non-climatic drivers. And in all regions, increases in extreme heat events have resulted in human mortality and morbidity. So folks, as if you didn't already know it, I think it's safe to say that we are already in a pretty sorry state as a global civilization, even if some of us are fortunate enough to be somewhat insulated from the most tangible existential consequences, at least for the moment anyway. The next question posed in the AR6 synthesis report is exactly what is the current state of progress with adaptation, where are the main gaps and what challenges do we need to overcome? And that's what we'll look at in the next deep dive video. That's it for this one though. Thanks for listening. Don't get too despondent. There are nuggets of better news coming in later videos, so stay positive if you can, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.